This is Tom Hayden, and I want to welcome you to the final week of our School of Activism workshop. This one is the final one with an opportunity for questions and answers. We've talked about a long war, we've talked about a long peace movement, and tonight, I'm afraid I have to tell you, this is going to be a long talk. I want to thank the people at Greenwald Studios, brave new studios here in Culver City, for their great work on this series. Jeff Yarslow, David Fisher, Sarah Hanks, Wesley Saver from the Peace and Justice Resource Center, which is headquartered here. I want to try to put what I've been saying about the long war in perspective and take a look at the dynamics of social movements. My old friend and mentor, Howard Zinn, who recently passed away, did a really wonderful job in writing history, rewriting history, really, to include all the excluded people in his book, The People's History of the United States, which hundreds of thousands of Americans have read. An example of going from the margins to the mainstream in just a couple of decades in terms of writing history. Building on Howard Zinn's work, I've been concentrating on trying to understand more about the model of social change and what kind of social change is possible in a clash that I'm describing as a clash between social movements and Machiavellians. Others have tried to depict history in terms of class struggle or civilization struggle. There are different ways to try to grapple with the problem, but I'm thinking from my own experience that the idea of Machiavellians as the power technicians who represent the state, corporations, the military, the mass media, are an array of power structures on the one side that is periodically confronted by social movements that represent more a cross-section or diversity of people, an incipient commonwealth without power. I also I want to pay tribute to and honor the achievements of social movements, because quite often they are seen as something that came from the establishment, as if the establishment gave us vacations, or they're minimized because more radical advocates don't think that they achieved enough. The reforms that I'm going to describe through our history were not revolutionary, although they were perceived that way by the powers that be at the time. Roosevelt's New Deal, for example, and Social Security were both described commonly by Republicans, business people, the newspapers, as Bolshevik schemes. On the other hand, the reforms were not really token, meaningless reforms like putting new faces in high places. The New Deal, to use the same example, altered the shape of the economy and decision-making to include the organized presence of workers represented by labor, which had not been the case before. It is true also that in the end, the power system, the Machiavellian system, having been reformed, survived and became a new status quo. It was not overthrown. Howard Zinn's history often minimizes these achievements because they fell short of a deeper revolutionary objective. It's not clear what that objective was. It's not defined. But Howard tended to celebrate the radicals, but not the reforms that they achieved. And I'll give you some examples because I have read his books quite closely and taught them. For example, the renters' uprisings in the Hudson Valley in the 1840s, he says, were repressed and diverted into voting, which left intact the basic structure of the rich and poor. The reforms of the progressive era, he says, were aimed at soothing protest. Winning women's suffrage after 100 years didn't make that much difference to women, he wrote. The result of the New Deal was to stabilize and preserve capitalism. The 8-hour day and child labor laws were, he says, quote, enough to dull the edge of resentment. The Zinn argument is a rebuke, on the one hand, to the mainstream top-down narrative that our American society's greatness lies in our flexible ability and capacity to accept reform. It's a narrative that points to the lesson that you should work within the system. And Howard Zinn's great contribution was to turn that top-down narrative upside down and point out that really it was the social movements that again and again achieved the reforms that made our country better. But the Howard Zinn idea that social movements are co-opted over time, it's a lesson for all organizers to learn. But my difficulty with that is the idea that nothing much came of all these reforms, or so little. I would like to honor the idea that people sacrificed to achieve significant reforms, not meaningless ones. And if it was only for a decade or a generation, they were important in their time. By a significant reform, I would use these criteria. Number one, did it empower individuals or groups of people who were structurally powerless beforehand? Secondly, did it create an opening in the institutions to represent those people? Third, did it prohibit behavior or policies that came before and replace that behavior and policies with new laws, new regulations, and new norms? Here's the model that I'm working on in skeletal form. Number one, I see social movements as arising somewhat mysteriously from the margins. That means unexpectedly. Think of them as never being predicted in advance. Second, they're always rooted, if they are strong, in a combination of a moral injury and indignity, sort of, a material grievance, something concrete, and memories that arise from previous struggles, legacies. Third, they're facing Machiavellian establishments who at first monopolize virtually all power and all memory. The movements have to suffer through intense moments of confrontation. They create what I call communities of meaning in order to sustain themselves for the long run and to improve their everyday lives during what can be a very, very long struggle. Sixth, in doing so, the movements gradually gain some popular support for their original demand, the core demand, if it resonates in the wider memory of society. Seventh, the movements arrive at a certain point with mainstream acceptance. To put a number on it, I'd say when you get 25% of the population sympathizing with you, you're beginning to enter the mainstream. And at that point, you begin to be caught up, like it or not, inevitably, in the pressures of politics and divisions, especially between what I call the more moderate and pragmatic or the more militant and radical wings of the movement. The more moderate or pragmatic wing tends to want to achieve the original demand and accept the larger system for the time being. And the more radical or militant wing tends to have come to the conclusion that all this struggle, all this jail time, all these sacrifices deserve more than the right to sit at a lunch counter or cast a ballot. Those original goals are replaced by more far-reaching ones that have come out of a radicalizing experience. Eighth, at the same time this is happening to the social movement, the Machiavellian powers are also dividing between the same tendencies, moderate and militant. The moderates accept the need, finally, for some sort of significant reform, in part just to stabilize the status quo and prevent a more radical change from occurring. The militants on the Machiavellian side believe that conceding any serious reform will encourage more reform and eventually doom their privileges and power. Ninth, eventually, sometimes after many years, even decades, the original reform is achieved through a process of negotiation, politics, legislation, and the emergence of new attitudes or norms. The reformers can declare victory, as do the moderate Machiavellians. The reform movement then, and this is the 10th point, rapidly declines and demobilizes with victory as people enjoy the benefit of the reform in their everyday lives and take a break. And at the same time, the divisions between more reformist and radical tendencies will increase as the base diminishes. And at the same time, a counter-movement then arises on the Machiavellian side among people who perceive that they have lost status, lost power, lost profit, and it gains strength. As the movement declines and demobilizes, the counter-movement, having been apparently defeated, actually grows. The more moderate counter-movement tries to contain and dilute or simply underfund the impact of the reform, while the more extremist tendencies, no matter how few they are, become much more intense and even very violent in their reaction to the loss of their status. The new equilibrium, let's call it, or the center, the new center or the reformed system, is stable for a period of years, can be a long time, even decades, as the reform itself becomes a norm that is embedded not only in laws and institutions, but in the culture of everyday life. The battle then turns to the field of memory, which is fought out around the meaning of the reform. Museums, monuments, and memorials become the battlegrounds. The social movement side of this equation wants a legacy that's going to inspire future generations and preserve the laws that were achieved and the norms. The hardline Machiavellians want to erase the memory and discredit the role of the movement in making history altogether. The moderates in the middle prefer a kind of selective memory which incorporates the movement into the national narrative. In 3 words, they want to claim that the system works. Now, that's the model. Let me apply it now to our history, and I'm speaking briefly, but I think there's a pattern that you will see.